This is my second video, looking at the differences between the Willys, Ford, and Hotchkiss Jeeps. In part 1, I looked at the chassis and the engine bay. I'll add a link in the description to the first video. In part 2, we're looking at the body, windscreen, and other small accessories attached to it. There's a long list of things to talk about, so this could be quite a long video. So while we are looking at the body this time, we are starting back in the engine bay for the first item. It is difficult to see the body number on the Willys and Ford when the vehicle is assembled. For both vehicles, the number was stamped onto the front of the left toe board gusset. While you can see the front of the gusset on this Willys, you can't make out the number. With the left fender removed from my Ford, you can see the toe board gusset more clearly. It isn't until you can get close up and straight onto the gusset that you can see the stamped number. 26504 in this case. On the Hotchkiss M201, the body number was stamped just above the firewall fuel filter. This close-up shows my Hotchkiss tub number, H7226. Early tubs just have a number, while later tubs have the letter H, followed by the number. The body, or tub of the Willys and Ford evolved over the production run, to make improvements, and to keep up with demand. If you want to know more about the wartime developments, check out the link in the description, to WorldWar2Jeeps.com. The early versions were known as script Jeeps, due to the vehicles having the manufacturer's name embossed in the rear body panel. This company advertising was stopped in July 1942. The first picture is an early Willys tub, which must have been from the first 4 months of production, as it has no glove box. The rear panel shows the embossed Willys name. The second picture is a Ford script tub, which at some point, has had a jerry can bracket added. There was no Hotchkiss equivalent of a script tub, and the French Jeeps never carried a manufacturer logo or name. Early grilles were made from welded steel flat bar, known as slat grilles. This lasted from November 1941 to February 1942. When Ford started manufacturing in February 1942, they produced the iconic pressed grille. Willys started using the Ford design in March 1942, and this picture shows a Willys grille. This picture is my 1943 Ford grille. The Ford grille is the same as the Willys, but is stamped on top with the Ford script, F. The Hotchkiss grille, at first glance looks identical to the wartime type. However, the French-made grille has a shallower depth of pressings, around 1/4 inch at the top and bottom curves, compared to the 1/2 inch of the Willys. Headlights next. The wartime lamps were sealed units, where the whole glass, reflector and filament were one unit. When the filament failed, the whole glass lamp unit needed replacing. This is a Willys Jeep. And here's the lamp housing and bracket with the hood open. My Ford doesn't look much different from the outside, and still looks like the Willys unit with the hood open. With the lamp removed from the housing, the bolt that holds the lamp housing to the bracket can be seen. In the center can be seen the Ford script, F mark. On the lamp housing itself, near to where the power cable goes in, there's another stamped Ford F mark. The lights on the M201 look similar to the wartime lamp, but are different. The lamp glass and reflector is a one-piece unit, but it uses a separate H4 fitting bulb. Some reflectors I've seen have a second small holder to one side of the main bulb, for a side light. The main bulb had yellow glass, which can be seen in the reflector in this image. To support the windscreen and keep the wipers clear of the hood, the wartime Jeeps had rubber or wooden blocks screwed to the hood. These are rubber blocks on this slat grille Jeep. This Willys has the wooden hood blocks, with a rope insert along the middle. This is a Ford Jeep, with the screen folded down, showing the screen resting on the blocks. When Hotchkiss fitted electric wipers to the windscreen, the motor couldn't easily be stopped with the wipers vertically. In some positions, the wipers would have fouled the wood blocks. Instead, Hotchkiss fitted steel hoops to the top of the screen, with the wiper arm under the hoop. With the screen down as seen here, the wipers can be stopped in any position, with the hoops holding the screen clear of the hood. On the MB and GPW, the windscreen rests on the wooden blocks attached to the hood. To stop airflow from flipping the screen up when driving, there are clamps bolted to the hood, which hook onto brackets on the screen frame. Both the Willys shown here, and the Ford, have the top clamp bolted directly to the hood. A similar hook holds the hood down. On the M201, the windscreen doesn't sit as low over the hood, due to the metal hoops around the wipers. This means the screen hooks don't reach. To lift the clamp slightly higher, a small wooden block is fitted between the hood and the clamp. The fender blackout light on the Willys and Ford look the same. The Ford of course is F-marked. This is the Willys MB, and this is the Ford blackout lamp. The Ford light has the Ford elliptical logo on the front. The Hotchkiss blackout light looks very different. It has a much flatter housing than the MB and GPW light, and the shroud is tapered. There are several different hinges to be found on Jeeps. This first example is on a Willys MB. It is attached with 5 bolts and has 9 segments to the hinge. The next hinge is on my Ford GPW. Once again, it is bolted in place with 5 bolts, and it has 9 segments. It also has the Ford script F stamped into it. This hinge is also fitted to a Ford, but this hinge is made from 11 segments. I've also seen the Willys MB Jeep with an 11-segment hinge. This is my Hotchkiss hinge. Like the Willys and Ford, it is attached with 5 bolts. This one is a 13-segment hinge. The last hinge is on a friend's Hotchkiss. Even more segments on this one, with 15. Wipers now. There are several wiper options to be seen. We're starting out with my Ford, which is fitted with manual wipers. Each wiper has a handle to operate it, and they are linked by a bar so they both operate together. Next we have a Willys MB, which is fitted with vacuum wipers. The 2 vacuum motors are bolted to the top of the inner screen frame, and are linked by a vacuum pipe. The pipe runs down the left side of the screen frame, around the screen pivot arm, and into the engine bay. The manifold provides the vacuum. The Hotchkiss had 2 different systems for powered wipers. This is my Hotchkiss, which was fitted with one central motor, with arms outwards to drive each wiper. The wipers had a clutch mechanism to allow manual operation. This front view shows the wipers in different positions, so at least one has been disconnected from the motor. This picture is another Hotchkiss, but this one is fitted with what appears to be an individual vacuum motor, attached directly to the wiper. There is a manual lever on the back, the switch is just to the left, and I think the vacuum pipe nipple is to the left of that, but there is no pipe connected. The inner screen handle on the Willys and Ford look identical. This is the Willys, and here's the Ford. They are both castings. The Hotchkiss M201 handle is made from a sheet of flat steel, stamped into the handle form. The first set of data plates are from an early Willys Jeep. These Jeeps didn't have a glove box, but the data plates were fastened in the same location. This set is on a later Willys Jeep. The center plate has the Willys name. These are made from either aluminium or zinc. Next is a Ford set made from aluminium. These plates are also on a Ford, but are a brass set. This is a mid-production steel set on a Ford, though badly corroded. Finally, the Hotchkiss data plates. On the early 6-volt and later 24-volt models, these were a one-piece plate, written in French of course. For a time, rebuilt Jeeps had 4 single data plates, the smallest being the details of the rebuild. This is the rebuild plate on my Hotchkiss. The rebuild was undertaken by ERGM at Le Maltournée. It gives the chassis number and the date of reception for the work. More about the French data plates can be found on Andy Carter's M201 website. See the links below. The notch in the instrument panel is another sign of a wartime Jeep, or a reproduction body built to the wartime pattern. There were several styles of wartime body, the ACM Type 1, ACM Type 2 and the Ford body, but all had a small notch near the center of the instrument panel. ACM being the American Central Manufacturing Company. It can be seen on this Willys Jeep, between the amp meter and handbrake lever. The same can be seen on my Ford, which uses the ACM Type 2 body. There is no notch on the M201 panel, and there are more spot welds, which are more pronounced. Imperial instruments were fitted to the Willys MB and Ford GPW. The temperature gauge was marked in Fahrenheit and the oil pressure in pounds per square inch, as on this Willys Jeep. There appears to have been several different gauge manufacturers, but the general layout was the same in the Willys and the Ford, seen here. Metric instruments were fitted to Hotchkiss Jeeps. Temperature was in Celsius, and pressure in bar. The kilometers per hour speedo features a secondary mileage counter with a reset button. The layout remained the same as the wartime Jeeps. There were two styles of floor inside the glove box. Initially, the Willys Jeep had no glove box from November 1941 to February 1942 on the ACM Type 1 body. Willys introduced the glove box in March 1942, on the ACM Type 1 body. It had two pressed ribs on the glove box floor to stiffen it. That design remained for Willys when the ACM Type 2 body was introduced in January 1944. On the Ford Jeep, the glove box was included from the initial production of Ford bodies in February 1942. They had a flat sheet floor to the glove box up until and including August 1942. From September 1942 until August 1943, Ford continued to produce their own bodies with a glove box, but this time including the ribbed glove box floor. From September 1943 until December 1943, Ford used the ACM Type 1 body from Willys. In January 1944, they switched to the ACM Type 2 body for the rest of their production. Both had the ribs. My Hotchkiss has the stiffening ribs on the glovebox floor. As yet, I don't know if this was common to all M201s, or whether mine has had a recycled wartime glovebox. Its major rebuild in 1966 introduced a mix of Willys, Ford and Hotchkiss parts into the Jeep. Just another challenge to identifying a Jeep. Now we're looking at the toe board gusset or firewall brace. The Willys MB gusset, on the ACM Type 1 body, is flat-sided with angular corners and 5 holes. The Ford GPW used a more rounded brace from the beginning of production of the Ford tubs. From January 1944, both Willys and Ford used the ACM Type 2 body, which used the Ford-style rounded brace. The Hotchkiss M201 and Ford GPW toe board gussets are quite similar. They have a triangle-shaped fillet, with rounded corners, and 3 holes. However, the holes in the Hotchkiss were a slightly different shape. Starting the Jeep was done via a foot switch. It was located ahead of the transmission and transfer case levers. This is the starter on a Willys MB. The Ford switch was in the same location. On my M201, the starter switch is a rubber-covered button on the dash above the speedo. I have seen them in various other places on M201s. A closer look at the floor shows this to be an early 6-volt Hotchkiss body, which started life with a floor starter like the wartime Jeeps. During its 1966 rebuild, the foot switch was removed and welded up, then replaced with the dash button. This could also happen to wartime Jeeps if used by the French Army post-war, and subsequently had been through the French Army rebuild program. The early Willys steering wheel, 1941 and 42, featured broad spokes and a large hub, and was molded in black plastic. A similar shaped wheel was used on the MB and GPW in 1942 and 43, but as shown here, they were molded in green plastic. The wire-spoked wheel, seen here on my GPW, was seen on Jeeps from 1943 to 1945. The Hotchkiss steering wheel had broad plastic spokes, a large center hub, like the early Willys wheel, and was molded in black plastic. The switches on the Jeeps from all 3 manufacturers were similar, and fitted in the same locations. This is the Willys MB, fitted with the rotary light switch, choke, ignition switch, hand throttle, and panel light switch. My Ford has a similar layout, except that to the left of the light switch is the blackout light switch. The light switch is also the push-pull type. The other switches are the same. On the Hotchkiss, the small rubber-covered switch on the left is the windscreen wiper switch. The positive electrical contact for the wipers is in the metal housing just above the light switch. The light switch is a rotary type, but differs from the Willys type in having a locking button above the rotary switch to prevent accidental illumination in blackout conditions. Below the rotary light switch is the blackout button. This kills the power to all lighting, to black out the vehicle quickly. The choke, ignition, hand throttle and panel light switch are in the same positions. The cowl reinforcing pillar on the Willys and Ford Jeeps both have a curved rear edge. On the Hotchkiss, the cowl pillar has a sharp kink. This is one of the quick and easy ways to spot a Hotchkiss body. There's a two-part clamp on all three Jeeps, that holds the steering column to the instrument panel. On the Willys MB shown here, and the Ford GPW, the part of the bracket in contact with the instrument panel, is riveted in place. On all of the Hotchkiss Jeeps I've seen, this bracket is bolted to the instrument panel. The roof canvas hooks onto studs, along the top edge of the windscreen. On the Willys, and the Ford, the studs are hollow. The stud in the top of the Hotchkiss screen is basically similar, but is solid metal, not hollow. A number of Hotchkiss Jeeps were specially built for use in the North African desert. There were a number of modifications made, covered in more detail on Andy Carter's M201 site. One of these modifications was to fit a bracket to the windscreen frame, onto which was mounted a powerful spotlight. Only Sahara Jeeps had this bracket and spotlight, and it was never a wartime Jeep feature. While my Hotchkiss was once painted in desert sand finish, it was never a Sahara Jeep. Due to the French Army rebuild program, Hotchkiss, Willys and Ford Jeeps may have been rebuilt with recycled Sahara parts. This is how my Jeep got its Sahara screen. Almost all the mirrors I've seen are the King B style, as seen on this Willys, and on this Ford. My own GPW didn't have a mirror when I bought the wreck to rebuild. I bought all my spares from the usual UK dealers, and must have got this mirror from one of them. It does differ from the other two mirrors I've shown, having its mounting stud offset from the center of the mirror. I don't know if this is wartime or post-war. The Hotchkiss Jeeps left the factory with a round mirror, like the wartime type. They were eventually replaced with larger, more rectangular mirrors, sometimes fitted to both sides of the Jeep. The front and rear bow brackets on all three designs look pretty much the same. The Ford brackets, of course, have the Ford script F stamped on them. The safety chains on the thumbscrew have a slightly different shape on the Hotchkiss. These 6 pictures are the rear bracket on the Willys, Ford, and Hotchkiss, and the front bracket, Willys, Ford, and Hotchkiss. The only obvious difference is the Hotchkiss front brackets have an extra hole through the top. The body handles on the Jeep were basically similar, but there were slight differences. The front handle on the Willys and Ford is a curved design. This is a Willys example, and this is a Ford. This shows the curved shape better. The Ford handles of course have the F stamp on the bolting flanges. The Hotchkiss front handle is much more angular in design, and has a shorter grab area than the wartime handles. The mounting flanges are also longer. The Willys rear handle, and the Ford rear handle, look the same, but as before, the Ford has the F stamp. The Hotchkiss rear handle looks similar again, but like the front handles, the bolting flanges are longer, with a tighter crimp of the tube where it meets the flange. The Willys MB wheel arch is smooth-sided on both the ACM Type 1 and 2 body. The Ford wheel arch has 2 vertical pressed stiffening ribs in the side, just behind the shock mount housing. These ribs are clearly visible in this external view. It also has another on the top behind the locker lid, introduced in May 1942. This picture shows an ACM Type 2 body on a Ford, so it has the smooth wheel arch sides, but the Ford ribbed locker lid. The M201 wheel arch is similar to the ACM Type 1 and 2 bodies. There is a slight difference, which I'll look at in the next section. My Hotchkiss was used as a radio Jeep, with a single seat in the center of the rear, with radios mounted on top of each wheel arch. As a result, there are numerous mounting holes in the top. On the front inside corner of the wheel arch, there is a small triangle fillet, where the sharp corner of the wheel arch would have been. This is the Willys version. Looking closely at the design, this triangle fillet is formed by folding the inside skin of the panel. 2 tabs on the other sides of the triangle are then spot welded to the top and front skins. The Ford-produced body has the same design, and this design continued with the ACM Type 2 body. On all the Hotchkiss Jeeps I've seen, this triangle is a separate part, welded in. The triangle has 3 tabs for attaching it, with the top and front tabs fitted externally on the wheel arch, and where the wartime Jeeps had the fold, the Hotchkiss tab is spot welded on the wheel side of the arch. I don't know whether it was designed like this, or whether it was as a result of cutting through the seams and edges of wheel arches during factory recycling of parts. Locker lids on the M201 and Willys MB were plain and flat. This is a Willys example. On the ACM Type 1 and 2 bodies, and the Hotchkiss body, the locker button was located within a round recess. Here's the Hotchkiss lid. On the Willys and M201, the lid hinge was held in place with individual nuts and bolts. The Ford GPW had a stiffening ridge all around the lid, and a circular embossed center. The inset image shows it more clearly. The Ford lids also have the Ford script F stamped in them. The Ford hinge was bolted, but the nuts inside the locker were brazed onto a strip of metal, rather than being individual nuts. On the Ford-built body, the locker button was located within a rectangle recess. Ford Jeeps that used the ACM Type 2 body would have the round locker button recess, but the Ford locker lid. This last picture is a bit of an oddity. I haven't seen any other Jeeps like it. It is an early Willys Jeep, within the first 4 months of production. It has a locker and a flat Willys-style lid, but there's no locker button or button recess. There's no obvious signs of repair to replace the skin where the button was. The lid hinge also has 4 bolts to mount it, rather than the more usual 3. The Willys and Hotchkiss footrests are made from 3 pieces, a tube and 2 brackets. The floor bracket is wrapped over the tube and welded, while the wheel arch bracket is welded to the end of the tube. This is the Willys footrest. The Ford GPW footrest was made from only 2 parts. The triangle-shaped floor bracket was welded on the end of the tube. Rather than another bracket at the wheel arch end, the tube was crimped and folded up to become the bracket. Unfortunately, I don't have any good pictures of the Ford footrest, as most Ford owners seem to fill the backs of their Jeeps with a load of junk. This is the Hotchkiss footrest. The basic design of the spare wheel bracket frame was the same from all 3 manufacturers. This example is on a Willys Jeep, and features the 3 stud fixing for the wheel. It shows several lightening holes, to reduce weight and metal use. These were the early war design. This made use of the natural holes in the wheel rim, to attach the wheel to the bracket. This next example is also on a Willys Jeep, but has a solid panel where the 3 studs are mounted. This is another oddity. I've seen replacement brackets on dealers' websites with the solid back, but they are all the 2 stud mounting types. Next is the Ford bracket, again with the 3 stud fixings and open framework. As we can see here, it has the Ford script F stamped next to the right side stud. My Hotchkiss has the later war-type bracket, with the solid back and 2 stud fixing. The large steel washer is held in place by 2 nuts, clamping the wheel onto the bracket. The 3 stud bracket was replaced by the 2 stud version, in August 1943 for the Willys, and October 1943 for the Ford. One source says November. The new design was due to cracking in the rear body panel. At the same time, they introduced a wheel support bracket, bolted to the chassis rear crossmember. Willys, Ford and Hotchkiss all used this additional wheel support with the 2 stud bracket. This is a Willys Jeep, with the support seen below the spare wheel. Here's the Ford bracket. Now, a close-up view of the Hotchkiss bracket. They all look the same to me, but I expect the Ford version was F-stamped. The ACM Type 1 and 2 bodies had a top hat-shaped bracket, welded horizontally across the back of the body, to hold the rear light fitting. A close-up can be seen on this ACM Type 2 body. Ford redesigned the bracket, saving a small amount of steel, by turning the bracket 90 degrees, and mounting it vertically. It was attached to the rear body panel at the bottom, and the locker floor at the top. Ford Jeeps with the ACM Type 2 body used the horizontal light bracket like the Willys Jeeps. Hotchkiss used the ACM Type 2 body style and had the horizontal top hat-shaped light bracket. On the Willys Jeeps, a reinforcing gusset was added to the rear panel, on the ACM Type 1 body in October 1942. This was to reduce panel stresses, from the weight of the spare wheel. It is a triangle flat sheet, with a 90-degree fold at the rear, 2 attached to the rear panel. The Ford brace was the same, and can be seen more clearly here, with the rear seat missing. From the table of modifications available from the World War II Jeeps.com website, it is unclear when Ford introduced this change. My May 1943 Ford has the reinforcing gusset, but I've been told they were also retrofitted to earlier Jeeps. On the Hotchkiss Jeeps, I've seen 2 different types of gusset. There's this one, on my early Hotchkiss, is flat like the Willys design, except for the triangle being cut, and folded over on top of the locker. That may have been to give clearance when the radio trays were fitted. The second design I've seen on later Hotchkiss Jeeps, has two small stiffening flutes, pressed into the triangle, partially hidden here by the seat frame. The rear light housings looked similar from all three manufacturers. This is on an early Willys and has CB marked below the lights. The lights were sealed units, where the bulb, case and colored lens was one, replaceable item. These two lights were dismantled for fitting brighter LED bulbs. Most Jeeps I've seen on the road today, have two tail and brake light units fitted for better visibility. My Ford has two from the KD Lamp Company. Looking at the parts supplier websites, the tail and brake unit goes on the left of the vehicle, while a blackout unit would be fitted on the right side. I don't have any Jeep pictures showing this, but I do have this GMC bolster truck with them. M201 lights look similar to wartime lights, but have a more angular steel pressing. This example has Army DUC and 28V embossed in the case. Cheese head screws hold the cover on. There were separate, replaceable bulbs. There appear to be a number of different reflectors used by the three manufacturers. The first example is on a Willys and is from the Arrow Safety Device Company at Holly, New Jersey. Willys also used the Corker and Brown reflector. I don't have any photos showing that, as many of the reflectors I've seen are covered by a thick layer of paint, hiding the markings. There's also this oval type of reflector, seen on a Willys. Next are two reflectors seen on Fords. The first is the Tiger Eye from Cincinnati, Ohio. The second is a Ford-marked, Guide A2. Hotchkiss next, with this type which uses the same mounting holes, but the reflector itself is smaller. Lastly is a yellow type, which was found on my Hotchkiss when first purchased. Hotchkiss Jeeps had a number plate light mounted under the jerry can bracket. The MB and GPW Jeeps don't. The last item on my list of differences is the roof and seat canvases. Willys, Ford and early Hotchkiss Jeeps, all had canvas seats and roof. This Willys is my first example. These seats are actually fitted to my Hotchkiss, but are modern copies of the wartime canvas seats. Here's a Ford with a winter canvas set fitted, totally enclosing the driving compartment. They warm up quite well from heat through the floor from the exhaust and transmission. Now this is my Hotchkiss as first found, still in its French, three-tone camouflage, and fitted with the vinyl roof and seats. The vinyl roof and seats weren't introduced until around 1970, sometime after the Hotchkiss production stopped. Prior to that, all the Hotchkiss Jeeps had the usual canvas, though with some modifications, which can be seen on the M201 website. Here's the vinyl roof removed, showing the clear plastic rear window. Lastly, a vinyl seat cushion. There are likely to be several other differences between the wartime Jeeps and the Hotchkiss M201. Those listed here are the ones I've picked up on so far, in 19 years of Hotchkiss ownership. Rebuilding my Ford Jeep was possibly the catalyst to looking further into the various differences between them. I hope you've found this interesting and educational, and you'll probably find yourself spotting Hotchkiss parts on Fords, and Willys parts on Hotchkiss Jeeps from now on. Don't forget to like and subscribe.